Dan Heng was the first character in Honkai Star Rail to get a second form, not as an alternate character path like the Trailblazer, but as an actual separate character that exists on your account alongside his original form. He was the one who set the precedence that allows for characters like Tingyan and Fugue to exist, or even the new March 7th and Evernight. And so it only seems fitting that he also ends up being the first character to have a third form enter the game as its own separate character. And just like when Imbibitor Lunai first released, Dan Heng's new form is coming in with some very impressive power, especially as a free unit. But how powerful is Heng Permansor Terrae, or Heng PT for short, or Dehupata for really short? He's the first physical preservation character, but could a free sustain really be all that powerful? Let's break down what he does, who his best teammates are, and how he compares to other sustain units, and whether or not you should build him after obtaining him for free when his banner goes live. If you already know what Heng PT's abilities do, skip to this timestamp to just dive straight into my thoughts on how he compares to other sustains, and how you can best utilize Heng PT's strengths. Otherwise, let's talk about his kit. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an Express Supply Pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. As with many characters, Heng PT's basic attack is just a normal single target hit of physical damage. His skill and talent are where things get a bit more interesting. But first, we need to talk about his talent so that we understand what his whole kit is about. Heng's talent summons a soul dragon whenever a character is under the bondmate status, which will be elsewhere in his kit. The soul dragon is an action bar summon, not a meme sprite. Think of it as being similar to Lightning Lord or Lingsha's bunny. It is not like Mem or Castor's dragon, where you get to control their actions to some degree. The soul dragon has a high base speed of 165, and every time it takes action, it cleanses one debuff from all allies and gives them a shield that can stack with itself every time it gets refreshed. Do note that Heng is our first attack scaling shielder, which is really interesting. Now, his skill is how he applies the bondmate effect. He selects the ally to designate as the bondmate, and that ally now has the soul dragon summon attached to them. This means that if he selects, say, Anaxa as the bondmate, Anaxa now essentially has the summon and can benefit from any abilities that would require Anaxa to have a summon, such as Sunday's extra damage percent from his skill, or even the Banana Amusement Planner ornament set. Casting Heng's skill also applies a shield to all allies, and again, this shield can stack up to 300% of the shield effect from his skill, or basically it can stack up to 3 times. To compare his shield strength to Aventurine, a basic E0 S0 Heng build can reach around 3500 attack at E0 S0. This means his skill gives a 1100 shield at a baseline, and by stacking up to 3 times, it can reach a shield strength of 3300 without accounting for external shield strength buffs or teammate attack buffs. Note that the shield provided by the Soul Dragon's actions are less than this, and also cannot exceed the 3300 limit, since the stacking limit of his shields is based on his skill's shield strength. Meanwhile, a basic Aventurine build can easily reach upwards of 4500 defense at E0 S0 if the build focuses solely on defense stats and relics. This would make Aventurine's shield at a baseline shield for 1400, and Aventurine's only stacks twice, up to 2800, again, without any shield strength buffs taken into account, such as the new relic set. So as you see, a fully stacked Heng shield is actually stronger than Aventurine's under similar investment assumptions. Obviously, they have different ways of refreshing their shields, Aventurine via his follow-up attacks, and Heng via his fast-moving dragon, but when both are under ideal conditions, Heng's shield does have a bigger number. And Heng's upsides don't stop there, because Heng actually has another way to stack his shield faster, his ultimate. Whereas Aventurine needs his E1 in order for his ultimate to apply his shield, Heng's ultimate already applies a shield, albeit the shield is the same strength as the shield from his dragon, rather than from his skill, meaning it's half the strength of his skill's shield, but it still helps stack his shield to max value when in conjunction with all of his other ways to stack his shield. In addition to giving this shield, it also does AoE physical damage, but the damage of this ultimate isn't very significant and is mostly only there for toughness damage breaking. However, the ultimate also enhances his Soul Dragon summon. While enhanced, the Soul Dragon can unleash a follow-up attack whenever it takes action. This follow-up attack has 2 parts to it. The first part is based on Heng's own stats, and since he isn't building any crit stats, it won't do much damage. The second part, however, deals a single proc of additional damage to all all enemies, similar to Robin or Triby's additional damage procs, except the Soul Dragon's additional damage can hit all enemies. This damage scales off of the bondmate stats, so if Anaxa is the bondmate and the Soul Dragon summon is attached to Anaxa, then the damage scales off of Anaxa's attack, crit, and damage percent, all of it. Because of this, the damage from the Soul Dragon can actually be quite significant, especially in AoE scenarios, because it scales off of your DPS stats. This enhanced state only lasts for 2 of the Soul Dragon's turns, so it can only launch this follow-up attack twice per ultimate. If you use another ultimate before the Soul Dragon uses these turns though, it technically can stack higher. Dan Heng's technique is also relevant, because it's actually my favorite type of technique in the whole game. His technique instantly casts his skill at the start of the battle. It gives all the energy of using his technique without costing a skill point, and it works similarly to Suridra's in that it casts the skill on whichever character you use to enter combat with. So it's the perfect way to immediately control who gets to be designated as the bondmate right at the start of the fight, as well as starting the team off with the shield from his skill. Now, as for his bonus abilities, Dan Heng's first one increases the attack of the bondmate by 15% of Dan Heng's own attack. If we go by our earlier assumption of an E0 S0 build with 3500 attack, this translates to 525 attack to your DPS, which is very relevant. Since you want to maximize Dan Heng's attack for his shield to begin with, maximizing his attack buff at the same time is just the cherry on top. A buff of 500 attack from your sustain is very strong, definitely stronger than Aventurine's 15% crit damage debuff on his ultimate. Furthermore, this attack buff has permanent uptime so long as you don't change who the Soul Dragon is attached to. His second bonus ability advances his own action at the start of battle by 40%, so it's essentially a free version of Sprightly Von Whack built into his kit. We'll talk about how this impacts his speed breakpoints in build later in the build section. Additionally, whenever the bondmate uses any attack, the Soul Dragon's action is advanced by 15%, and Dan Heng regenerates 6 energy, which is really nice for his energy rotation, as we'll also discuss in his build section. For his last bonus ability, the Soul Dragon gives an additional small shield to the ally with the lowest amount of shield whenever it takes action, so it's just a little bit of extra security for whichever ally has been taking the most damage. Additionally, when the enhanced Soul Dragon does its follow-up attack, it deals even more additional damage to the enemy with the highest HP, scaling off of the bondmate stats once again, just like the other proc of additional damage from the Soul Dragon. So essentially, this bonus ability just gives more shielding and more damage, which honestly probably could have just been included on his talent and ultimate themselves, but oh well, here it is on his bonus ability. For his stat traces, Dan Heng has mostly all good stats. Attack and speed are good for obvious reasons, since those are the only stats he wants anyway, and then the defense is sort of just there for the sake of it. It technically means his own shield on himself won't break as fast, since his defense will be higher, which can be nice. Now, since Dan Heng PT is free, we have to mention his early vertical investment options, starting with his Eidolons. His E1 mainly affects his ultimate, causing it to recover 1 skill point and give the bondmate 18% res pen for 3 turns. While this is a nice and comfy Eidolon, and res pen is a really nice buff for a sustain to give, the fact that it only lasts for 3 turns means it'll have some downtime in teams that use Sunday, since Sunday is doubling the DPS's turns, so you really shouldn't think of it as a permanent 18% res pen buff. Still, it's obviously really nice, especially in teams that don't have any sources of res pen readily available, but given that we already get his E0 for free, it's very unnecessary to go pulling for another copy of Dan Heng just for his E1. His E2 gives his Soul Dragon 2 extra usages of its follow-up attack, and his ultimate now immediately action advances it as well, so it can take action and spend one of its attacks. Additionally, it just straight up doubles the damage of the Soul Dragon's additional damage, aka the damage that scales off of the bondmate stats, and it also doubles the shield effect that it provides, so it's both an offensive and a defensive Eidolon. While this Eidolon is both strong and also fun, since it allows the dragon to do more attacks, it also feels very unnecessary. E3 and E5 are just trace level increases as usual. The E4 reduces the bondmate's damage taken by 20%, which feels really bad, because if you're going to give him a defensive Eidolon, why not at least make it apply to the whole team? But nope, it only applies to the bondmate. Just another sad E4. Finally, Dan Heng's E6 makes all enemies take 20% increased damage, so long as the bondmate is on the field. So it's essentially a permanent 20% vulnerability debuff for all enemies, while also allowing the bondmate to ignore 12% of the enemy's defense. Additionally, his ultimate now also deals additional damage that scales off of the bondmate's stats, similarly to his Soul Dragon's follow-up attack, except the scaling for this is double the damage of his Soul Dragons, so his ultimate is now able to hit pretty hard at E6. But all in all, none of these Eidolons are that crazy. I know some people thought they might try and bait people with crazy Eidolons, since they were giving his E0 version out for free, but I think Hoyo ended up giving away a character who was already really strong at E0, and then his vertical investment options actually just ended up being minor upgrades that you really don't need to feel the need to invest in unless you just really love Dan Heng. And even then, vertically investing in a sustain isn't a super high priority anyway, even if his vertical investment options increase more than just his sustain power. And speaking of his vertical investment options, we should discuss his signature Lightcone. It has a large base attack as well as a massive 64% attack buff for Dan Heng. I repeat, the attack buff on the Lightcone is only for Dan Heng himself. If you want to know how it translates to Dan Heng's own attack buff, since Dan Heng's buff scales off of his own attack, Dan Heng's signature Lightcone roughly translates to 700 extra attack on Dan Heng compared to other Lightcone options. This then translates to roughly an extra 100 attack buff for the bondmate, and also roughly 420 extra shield power at max shield stacks. An extra 100 attack for the bondmate is nice, but not the biggest deal in the world. It does also give 36% damage bonus, however, so in terms of overall buffing, the Lightcone offers 100 attack for the bondmate, 36% damage bonus for the bondmate, and extra survivability via shielding, and also its additional effect of providing healing for the whole team, and extra healing for the ally with the lowest HP every time he uses his ultimate. The healing isn't the biggest thing in the world, since his shields are already very comfortable. The extra survivability you'll find in this Lightcone really only even takes effect in Anomaly Arbitration. If you aren't interested in pushing to clear Anomaly, then the extra survival effects from this Lightcone probably won't even activate in most content due to how comfy his shields already are. Even in Anomaly Arbitration, the Lightcone isn't necessary to survive, and you can make do with alternatives. But speaking of alternatives, Dan Heng doesn't have any obvious alternative Lightcone options. Since he's our first attack scaling preservation character, there isn't a single preservation Lightcone that buffs attack. Thus, my suggestion would be to use an off-path Lightcone that has the highest base attack you can find. If you have some of the standard 5-star Lightcones, such as Himiko's or Clara's or Welt's, all of these have 582 base attack. Archer's Lightcone also has 582 base attack if you got that from the Archer pulling event, and that's also perfectly usable on Dan Heng. Obviously, you won't get anything out of the Lightcone effect, since Lightcone effects don't activate on characters of a different path, but the higher base attack is still more useful than most other preservation Lightcone effects, since higher base attack affects Dan Heng's shielding and his buffing power. There are a few honorable mentions I'll give to some of the preservation Lightcone effects you could use. First off is the aggro increasing Lightcones, Landau's Choice, as well as Japard's Lightcone. These Lightcones increase Dan Heng's aggro, making him more likely to be hit by enemies. This can be helpful if you need the enemy hits for Dan Heng's energy rotation. I don't really recommend doing this, but I figured I'd mention it. Japard's Lightcone can also be used for Dan Heng if you're using him in a DOT team with Kafka, because Kafka gives 100% attack to all characters who have 75% effect hit rate. So you actually do want to reach 75% effect hit rate on Dan Heng in DOT teams, so he can get this attack buff, and Japard's Lightcone gives effect hit rate to help meet this requirement. Outside of these niches though, I wouldn't recommend these over just using an off-path Lightcone with high base attack. The new Battle Pass Lightcone is also notable because it increases shield strength directly and also has a damage buffing passive. But while these things might sound nice, they're offset by the fact that this Lightcone has abysmal base attack. It's still usable in spite of this, especially with super impositions over multiple battle passes to increase its effect, but it's never going to be standing head and shoulders above just running an off-path Lightcone. Lastly, I'll mention both Fushuan and Aventurine's Lightcones. Fushuan's Lightcone is just an energy recharge stat stick, and that's it. The rest of its effect doesn't matter for him, and the base attack is also not good, but I figured I'd mention it just in case you want the energy recharge. Aventurine's signature also has no good stats for Dan Heng. He doesn't care about defense or crit damage, since his shield scales off of attack, and his damage scales off of the bondmate's crit stats and not his own. However, the Soul Dragon's follow-up attack is able to proc Aventurine's signature Lightcone's 10% vulnerability debuff. In terms of raw damage buffing, this isn't really that great considering the trade-off is losing out on a lot of base attack, but the debuff can be nice in Acheron teams when Trend isn't very reliable. When Trend is reliable, however, you can just use that on Dan Heng to add debuffs in Acheron teams. So overall, Dan Heng's Lightcone options are basically just whatever the heck you have on your account with high base attack, and that's it. However, unlike Evernight, who really suffers from a lack of accessible Lightcone options, Dan Heng is fine with this because he's so lenient in terms of stat necessities. Sure, he has no great Lightcone options, but he doesn't need any great Lightcone options in order to fulfill his job as a sustain and attack buffer. Now, even though I've said he doesn't need his Lightcone or his E1 in order to perform well, some of you may still be curious as to which way you should vertically invest if you want to, since he is releasing for free. Before you decide, I would suggest you test him out first. Do you need more sustain and anomaly arbitration? If so, then his Lightcone can help with that. However, do note that the extra skill point from his E1 essentially also translates to more sustain because it essentially allows him an extra use of his skill if need be for more shielding. His E1 also has the stronger buff since the damage bonus on his Lightcone has the same 3-turn restriction that the res pen on his E1 has. So overall, I prefer Dan Heng's E1 since I value the res pen more and the skill point gives more options in terms of how you use it. But his Lightcone is technically a more straightforward survival increase if you care about that. Let's talk about teams next. Dan Heng's teams are rather straightforward. He's a sustain unit, and easily one of the most comfortable sustains in the game, so you can technically slot him in anywhere just for survivability. For example, even in break teams where he does nothing for them because his Soul Dragon's attack can't inherit break effect from the bondmate, he's still a fine option just to keep the team alive if need be. The main thing Dan Heng has going for him above other sustains is his buffing potential, and his buffing potential is only really fully unlocked by Sunday teams. Since Dan Heng's gimmick is the ability to give the DPS a summon, thus unlocking the 50% damage bonus from Sunday's skill that usually can't be given to DPS characters unless they have a summon, pairing Dan Heng with Sunday is a huge boost to your DPS in addition to Dan Heng's 500 attack buff. Because of this, the teams that use Dan Heng the best are inherently going to be Sunday teams, especially Sunday teams who didn't already have a summon. Characters that already use Sunday, such as Anaxa or Saber, get a lot out of Danheng's additional buffing. Some of these characters, such as the aforementioned Saber as well as Aglaya, still would really prefer the energy from Huohuo, given how energy hungry they are. But Danheng is always going to be the more comfortable version for them, as well as providing bigger buffs given that his attack buff is permanent, compared to Huohuo's attack buff only lasting 2 turns. HP scaling characters, or characters that want to lose HP, obviously would never want to be run with a shielder, so don't even consider Mighty or Jingliu or Blade, even though they also want Sunday teams. Fainan is another character who currently uses Sunday, and Danheng is undoubtedly Fainan's best sustain in terms of raw buffing. He's nearly able to compete with some third harmony supports such as Bronya, and he straight up beats out the likes of Tingyan. Additionally, his dragon can follow Fainan in Fainan's territory to keep him alive if need be. However, Danheng's issue for Fainan is core flame stack generation, since he would have to spam his skill just to give one measly stack for Fainan's ultimate, which doesn't feel great. His ultimate and his Soul Dragon's shields do not give any stacks for Fainan, so he feels rather underwhelming in that department. And in scenarios where Fainan can get away without needing a sustain, Fainan would always choose to do so instead of slotting Danheng into the team. Here's the way I summarize Danheng's usage with Fainan. If you don't run Danheng and you instead run Fainan Sustainless, you may need to reset for survival. If you do run Danheng with Fainan, then you may need to reset for core flame stacks from enemy RNG hitting Fainan. Either way, there are pros and cons, and the potential need for resets one way or another. All that to say, Danheng is definitely not the perfect sustain unit Fainan would have liked, definitely nowhere near the level of Hyacinth for Casterus, but he is technically the sustain with the highest buffing potential for Fainan, particularly when paired with Sunday. So that's nice, I guess, if you need to run a sustain with Fainan. For example, in Anomaly Arbitration, where sustain is mandatory even for Fainan. And I briefly touched on Anaxa earlier, but I need to linger on the synergy to touch upon just how good Anaxa is with Danheng. He has everything Danheng wants in a teammate. He synergizes with Sunday, he's an attack scaling character who benefits a lot from attack buffs since he doesn't have any in his kit, and he attacks super frequently with constant skill usages, especially when paired with Saridra or Robin, in order to action advance the dragon and charge Danheng's energy, since Danheng gets energy every time the bond mate does an attack. In my opinion, Danheng feels like he was made for Anaxa. There is no other character that utilizes Danheng as well as Anaxa does, and this is partially because Anaxa didn't have any other sustains that did too much for him, since his energy rotation doesn't need Huohuo. However, it should be noted that Sunday's place on Anaxa teams is currently looking a little bit dubious with the upcoming release of Cyrene, so Danheng's buffing potential might not be quite at its peak if Sunday is kicked off the team. Still, the synergy between Danheng and Anaxa is still notable due to Anaxa not having any sustains that synergize super well with him to begin with. Apart from teams who already want to use Sunday, Danheng's synergy with Sunday is actually so strong that he enables teams that aren't currently using Sunday to suddenly be able to use Sunday. Fei Xiao follow-up teams wouldn't usually jump to mind as a Sunday team, and yet due to the additional buffing Danheng provides when paired with Sunday in comparison to Aventurine, the pairing of Danheng plus Sunday now ends up being competitive as Fei Xiao's best in slot sustain team, replacing Aventurine plus whatever follow-up unit you were using, or situationally replacing even Robin. I don't think the Sunday variant strictly beats the safer variant of Fei Xiao teams in all scenarios, but it is competitive with it, and it does outperform it in some scenarios, which just goes to show how powerful Danheng can be when paired with Sunday. In addition to Fei Xiao, there's Archer. Archer is most known for being reliant on Sparkle, but the Danheng plus Sunday synergy is actually capable of competing with Sparkle in Archer teams. Sparkle will still pull ahead when she gets really good RNG, such as enemy hits charging her ultimate faster than usual, or with really good quid pro quo RNG from Gallagher, but outside of these scenarios, running Archer in a -1 speed setup with Sunday plus Danheng PT, where Archer gets a free basic attack before every Sunday skill, very comfortably competes with the Sparkle variants of Archer's teams, which is huge for anyone who wants to play Archer but didn't pull Sparkle. Do note that Sunday's Lightcone is recommended for these teams, but it's also recommended for Sparkle as well anyway. Lastly, I want to recommend our resident emanators, Acheron and Herta. Running one of the broken harmony units like Tribi, Robin, or Sunday was already a really strong strategy for Acheron, even when Acheron is E0. The introduction of Cypher and the reworked Silverwolf gave her more strong Nihility options to work with nowadays, but the Sunday plus Danheng PT synergy revives the strategy of just using Sunday with Acheron, even when Acheron is E0. Similarly to Fei Xiao and Archer, it's not necessarily strictly better in every scenario, but it is competitive with their current best team options. As for Herta, the Sunday plus Danheng PT combo is very good for her, but the Tribi plus Hyacinth combo is better in scenarios where you'd normally use Herta anyway. Still, the synergy is good enough that I wanted to mention that Sunday is a lot more usable in Herta teams now than before. And then for teams that don't already use Sunday and don't want to use Sunday under any circumstance, there's DOT and break teams. I mentioned earlier that break teams would only use Danheng if they need the extra survivability, in which case, he's just functioning as a comfortable sustain in those teams who doesn't do anything special, which is completely fine if that's what you need. As for DOT teams, the current sustain with the best energy with them is Huohuo, due to her ability to refill the entire team's energy and buff all of their attack. Danheng is a more single target version of Huohuo, where his attack buff is only for one character, but the trade-off is that he's more comfortable than Huohuo on basically every level. His attack buff, while limited to only one character, is permanent, unit. His sustain capability is much higher than Huohuo's, and he's much more skill point friendly than Huohuo, which is relevant for DOT teams given how skill point hungry they can be. So these trade-offs can end up making Dan Heng the better option in DOT teams over Huohuo when you need the stronger shielding and more skill points while not sacrificing too much in terms of buffing, since his attack buff will at least always be active on the main DPS of the DOT team, which is usually going to be Hysolins nowadays. As you can see, Dan Heng is super flexible as a sustain unit, basically being usable in any team that needs his powerful shields to keep them alive, while having enough synergy with Sunday in terms of providing offensive buffs that he's even able to shake up certain team archetypes. All of this for a free unit is super nice. With the notable teams out of the way, let's finally jump into how to build this free shielder. His build is very straightforward. He only scales off of one stat, and that's attack. His shield scale off of his attack buff scales off of his own attack, and then all of his damage scales off of the bondmate stats, so he doesn't need any crit stats or damage percent stats whatsoever. Attack is all that matters. Of course, speed also always matters. If you're going to ask for speed requirements for Dan Heng, the answer is pretty much just build as much speed as you need skill points for. Dan Heng's goal is to spam basic attacks as much as possible to build up skill points, and he generally doesn't need any fancy rotation stuff or any specific speed tuning. Do remember that Dan Heng essentially has a Von Rack action advance built into his kit for completely free, so this affects speed tuning as well. The most common speed breakpoints you'll see people build for is to get 2 turns in the first cycle, which is where the 134 speed breakpoint comes from, or aiming for 2 turns in the first cycle and the second cycle, which requires 160 speed. Dan Heng's built-in Von Rack essentially changes these speed requirements to 125 speed or 145 speed. So if you want pseudo 160 speed for 2 turns in the first 2 cycles, you can build speed boots on him to reach 145 speed, and that's mostly all you'll need. Otherwise, if you can reach 125 speed with attack boots, and you'd prefer to do that because you don't care for giving him more turns outside of the first cycle, then that'll be doable too. Basically, for Dan Heng, 125 is his version of 134 speed, and 145 is his version of 160 speed. Since action value resets between waves, 134 or 160 speed are still fine and relevant breakpoints to build for, since his Von Rack buff won't activate when going into the second wave. Other than the boots, always run an attack chest, attack orb, and then things get complicated with the rope. Obviously, there are only 2 choices here, attack rope or energy rope. Dan Heng gets 6 energy every time his bondmate attacks, so his energy rotation largely depends on who the bondmate is. I'll spare you the exact numbers of his energy rotation, but in general, since Dan Heng wants to spam his basic attack as much as possible, he's going to have somewhere around a 3 to 4 turn ultimate rotation, even with an energy rope. Obviously, getting hit by enemies can affect this rotation, but generally if you don't run an ER rope, then you're looking at a 4 turn ultimate rotation, which means you're going to have a lot of downtime where the dragons aren't doing any damage. With an ER rope, you can safely expect a 3 turn ultimate rotation in most of his teams, assuming he's being run with Sunday, since Sunday allows the bondmate to act more often, which then translates to more energy for Dan Heng via his bonus ability. Therefore, I would generally recommend an ER rope over an attack rope. If you're worried about losing too many stats by losing the attack rope, let's look at what we actually lose. An attack rope roughly translates to an extra 500 flat attack on a regular Dan Heng PT build. That 500 attack from the rope translates to an extra 300 shield health when the shield is fully stacked, so it'll be even less than that when the shield isn't fully stacked, as well as translating to an extra 75 flat attack for his attack buff. These extra stats are nice, but as you can see, you aren't losing out on a huge amount of stats by sacrificing an attack rope for an ER rope, so I wouldn't stress out about it too much. As long as you're reaching upwards of 3,500 attack without his signature Lightcone, or above 4,000 attack with his signature Lightcone, you'll be good to go. Now, the one scenario where you actually can consider dropping an ER rope for an attack rope is with Anaxa. Anaxa attacks so many times, especially when paired with Sunday and Saridra, that he can actually give Dan Heng PT a comfortable 3-turn ultimate rotation, even without an energy rope. In fact, it's nearly enough to give Dan Heng PT a 2-turn ultimate rotation, even without an energy rope, depending on enemy RNG. So Dan Heng can definitely get away with an attack rope when paired with Anaxa for slightly stronger buffing and shielding. I want to mention Finon here as well. There are a lot of scenarios where Dan Heng is never getting a second ultimate for Finon because he doesn't get to take enough turns, since Finon kicks his team out for most of the fight. In these scenarios, it's also okay to give Dan Heng an attack rope just for marginally better buffing and shielding, because oftentimes the energy rope ends up giving you no value. Outside of these scenarios, for general purpose use case, I would recommend an energy rope. As for his relic set, he has a new one that was released specifically for him, the shielding set, and this is what I would recommend. It gives more shield strength than 2-piece attack, and it also buffs more than a 2-piece attack set. But if you have nothing else and you need to run 2-piece sets, then that's completely fine. While there are ideal things to build on Dan Heng, he is very much not picky about what you give him. He'll work fine regardless. For planar ornaments, pick between any of the buffing planners, such as Lushaka, Broken Keel if you have the effect res, or even Penacony if you're playing him with a physical DPS. The difference between these is very small. I personally prefer Lushaka for the 5% energy, and because the attack buff is just very flexible for every team, since he's never going to be played outside of an attack scaling team anyway. So that's how you build Dan Heng PT, as well as every everything you need to know about which teams he synergizes with. Obviously, he synergizes best with attack scaling carries who utilize Sunday, especially characters that don't already have a summon, thus allowing Dan Heng to enable the extra buffing from Sunday's skill. But even if you don't have Sunday, Dan Heng is just generally one of the most comfortable sustains in the entire game, and every single account is going to be able to get a lot of good use out of him no matter what, especially in Anomaly Arbitration, where I expect Dan Heng PT to be one of the most used characters. While characters like Dr. Ratio and Archer were very powerful, free, single target DPS characters that came with a lot of skill expression on their release, I honestly think Dan Heng PT is the best free character we've gotten so far due to his ease of use, simplicity to build, and his flexibility in what teams you run him in. Not to mention the fact that he essentially is going to help every single player in the game suddenly see a massive jump in survival power. Seriously, if you're struggling to survive in current content, don't stress about it and just wait until Dan Heng enters your account. I unironically think this free character is going to save a massive portion of the player base, especially the more casual portion. So the fact that he's going to be a free character at least up until the end of version 4.0, according to their official announcement, is a very rare but huge W from Hoyo. This character is so comfortable, and I cannot wait for everyone to get him on their accounts. How excited are you for the free Dan Heng? Do you need him to help you survive current content? Have any more questions about his builds or teams? Leave a comment down below, and I'll try to respond. And be sure to like this video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. There's plenty more content on the way, especially in regards to the upcoming Cyrene, so be sure to stick around for that, and subscribe to the channel to not miss more videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. Until next time!